Welcome to Lecture 18, which is now covering Chapter 14 on the autonomic nervous system. So we're going to see that the autonomic nervous system is going to primarily, for its motor function, is going to be operating or innervating smooth and cardiac muscle. These are things you don't want to have full voluntary control over. It makes adjustments to various body activities and body systems. Is the main coordinator of the body and works together closely with the endocrine systems. And again, it operates basically by subconscious control. And we do give it other names like the involuntary nervous system or the general visceral motor system. So to look at where it lies again, the autonomic nervous system is classified under the peripheral nervous system. And whether this is correct or not fully, the motor or efferent division and the autonomic nervous system is right there. It's related to the somatic system, which we usually associate with skeletal muscle control, okay, whether it's voluntary or involuntary, we now know, okay, and then we can divide the autonomic into the sympathetic and parasympathetic, which there are components that are sensory, but most of that sensory feedback is going to be for the autonomic muscle control within this system, usually smooth and cardiac muscle. So this is a self-feedback system that sometimes takes in its own sensory information and uses that to regulate itself. So what's the difference between the somatic and the autonomic? It's a type of effectors again. That means the muscles and the glands that are affected. The efferent pathways are separate between the somatic and autonomic, and the target organ responses to neurotransmitters are going to be different between the somatic, which is, primarily going to be acetylcholine talking to skeletal muscle. With the autonomic, it's all these other little neurotransmitters we learned about, okay? And sometimes we have differences in the receptors too that allow grading and different responses to the neurotransmitters. So the effectors, again, just in summary, for the somatic, going to be skeletal muscles. For the ANS, going to be glands, various regions of organs, okay, cardiac, smooth muscle. We mean glands, we mean also not just secretory glands, but also endocrine system glands, including features in the brain. Somatic pathways are going to be very heavily myelinated, okay, and they're going to be very specific tracks from the CNS. The autonomic, okay, are usually going to be in the CNS. They're going to be lightly myelinated, and in some cases, they're going to be unmyelinated because they're going to be very close to their region where they do their jobs. So, guys, it's going to be very important to distinguish how the spinal nerves, the somatic nerves, differ from the autonomic track. Because remember, the autonomic nervous system, the parasympathetic and sympathetic, they're going to come from different regions. Plus, we're going to see that part of the sympathetic is going to parallel somatic nerves. So how are we going to distinguish these tracks? And it's going to be by looking at the appearance and how many neurons it takes to communicate from the central nervous system to the organ that we're affecting, producing a response in. So let us first look at the somatic. That means your spinal nerves. We're going to see that the neuron starts in a particular region of the spinal cord. And this is going to be bunches of neurons together in fascicles. So we have one neuron that goes down the whole length of where it's supposed to go, and then usually produces the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. And usually the muscle or gland that this is going to produce the neurotransmitter for, these usually have receptors that are excitatory to the acetylcholine. So one nerve runs the whole length of where it needs to go. And this gets very crazy on how long these nerves get. When you think about one nerve runs from your cervical region to the tips of your fingers, and you have a nerve that runs from the lower lumbar region to the to the bottom of your feet, basically. Now with the autonomic, we have to look at the difference between the parasympathetic and sympathetic. The parasympathetic and sympathetic come from different regions where the the base of their motor neuron is. So what happens here is we see with the sympathetic, this is going to come from, these neurons basically come from the lumbar thoracic region. And what they do is they're going to run parallel in bundles with the peripheral system a lot of times. And what happens here, guys, instead of having one neuron, you have two that work in a team. It slows things down, but it also allows finer degrees of regulation because we can modify this one here. So we have what's called the preganglionic axon, because there's this thing called a ganglion. It's a bunch of nerve cell bodies from the postganglionic neuron. So we have what's called the preganglionic nerve and the postganglionic. So here's your preganglionic nerve or neuron and your postganglionic. And this region is a lump of, again, nerve cell bodies called a ganglion. So what happens when the signal wants to get out of the central nervous system for the sympathetic, it starts out spinal cord, goes out, hits this thing called a ganglion, which we're going to see runs as a trunk that runs parallel. It's a secondary spinal cord. It runs parallel on either side of the spinal cord. There's two of these, left and right. So it reaches that little area and usually acetylcholine is produced. Please know that. And then this is usually excitatory to the acetylcholine. Possibly not always. This signal then comes out and then produces norepinephrine, or what we call noradrenaline. Either term is okay. This is not the same chemical produced by the adrenal glands. That is actually epinephrine or adrenaline, but they are related and sometimes act the same. They could overlap. That means adrenaline or noradrenaline, adrenaline or epinephrine can actually interfere with this process in the sympathetic system. So what happens then is this usually goes to an excitatory receptor in the viscera where that nerve goes to. That means the organ where that nerve goes to, the smooth muscle or some type of gland. Now, there is variation in the sympathetic system. You can get this moderately length preganglionic, and usually we say the preganglionic is short compared to what you see in the parasympathetic. We'll see that in a little while. So what happens here is you get another one where sometimes you get direct contact with the preganglionic and there's really no postganglionic. And particularly this is true where the sympathetic nervous system is communicating with endocrine system. So this is kind of really neat in a way. And what happens here is we see that this nerve cell goes to the adrenal glands and produces epinephrine. Okay, rather than norepinephrine as a neurotransmitter, it uses acetylcholine to produce epinephrine that becomes a hormone in the blood rather than just a neurotransmitter that goes to nearby cells. And this is what controls and regulates and integrates the parasympathetic nervous system and sympathetic nervous system to the endocrine organs. Now, the parasympathetic system, on a test, what you have to say is that the preganglionic axon, that means the number one axon, is very long. It literally goes right to a ganglion that sits on the organ itself. That means the organ is right here, whereas here the organ is here. This is a good distance. So what happens here is you have this long preganglionic, short or sometimes non-existing postganglionic axon. And here again in this ganglion that sits on the organ, on the parasympathetic system, you get acetylcholine, but here's what's different now, is you get acetylcholine produced by the postganglionic axon, and that acetylcholine then goes to receptors that either inhibit or excite in various degrees an acetylcholine receptor. So it could be a sensitive receptor, a sensor that needs a lot of acetylcholine, or one that requires very little, or one that actually produces an inhibitory response rather than excitatory. So it means it lowers that electrical potential in the axon and makes it more difficult for that receptor to cause a response. So this is really kind of cool when we look at this. So just kind of memorize these differences between the somatic having one, autonomic having typically two, except in a couple of examples, the sympathetic having a short presynaptic ganglion, usually an equally long or longer postsynaptic ganglion that travels to the organ, and the parasympathetic usually has a very long presynaptic ganglion and a short or non-existing postganglionic. Now, guys, I'm not going to make you memorize the myelin because in somatic you have longer nerves that require more insulation to speed up the response. That is not necessarily true with the autonomic nervous system. It doesn't need that quick a response, and sometimes it's non-myelinated because these are so short they don't really need that, and you don't need the speed. Endocrine system is not based on speed. It's based on a very careful, slow modulation of the body. So what are the neurotransmitters, again, of the autonomic nervous system? They're what are called cholinergic fibers. And we didn't cover this earlier. They produce acetylcholine. The old term is cholinergic. That means they use acetylcholine. Chola basically means, is related to cholinergic. Okay, acetylcholine is produced in all preganglionic axons, whether it's sympathetic, parasympathetic. Typically, I don't know of any examples that don't match that. Okay, it's also produced by the parasympathetic postganglionic axons. So the sympathetic system uses acetylcholine only once, the parasympathetic usually twice. Okay, and again, this gives particular degrees of control. Then adrenergic fibers are found to produce norepinephrine, okay, in the sympathetic system, particularly the postganglionic. And this is usually an excitatory signal, but sometimes it can have other effects depending on the receptor that those neurotransmitters interact with. And again, there's some exceptions, like, whatever with, certain glands too, of what's produced by these postganglionic fibers. So guys, this is very complex. There are some generalities, but also exceptions. But on a test, just know the generalities. So now the receptors, that means who's receiving the neurotransmitters. And this varies with each organ and sometimes within an organ. So we have cholinergic receptors, which respond only to acetylcholine, and adrenergic receptors, which respond to either norepinephrine or sometimes epinephrine. That means the hormone that actually comes out of the adrenal glands and are released by other tissues. Now, when we look at the cholinergic receptors, that those respond to acetylcholine, there are receptors that respond to acetylcholine in what's called the nicotinic or muscarinic names. And these are actually drugs that looked at subsets of the cholinergic receptors and subsets of that. And guys, in AMP2, they will talk about this because this is part of pharmacology. That means there is no one acetylcholine effect, even though there's one acetylcholine. And nicotinic receptors are sensitive to nicotine. This is why when you smoke cigarettes, you can stimulate nicotinic receptors and it acts like acetylcholine in the blood. And there's a drug called muscarinic acid, which comes from deadly mushrooms. Okay, and these can have a toxic effect that resembles acetylcholine in the body. And then the adrenergic receptors, it means that ones that respond to epinephrine, adrenaline, or noradrenaline, or norepinephrine. The nor just means a variation of. They're what are called alpha and beta types, and there's even other types out there. And there's subtypes of these. And we learned this by looking at drug actions. There's different drugs that fit into different receptors, so that we don't have to make a drug that just affects the alpha or the beta or all of them together. Because in the old days, drugs were not receptor specific. And that means when they gave a cardiac drug that was affecting the parasympathetic nervous system or sympathetic nervous system, the drug had a general effect on the body and large side effects. Now we can make a drug that just attacks one receptor and then works on just that particular feature of the autonomic nervous system, particularly when it comes to cardiac and respiratory physiology. We've gotten much better on how we interact with these receptors. So please know when you get into the coverage of particularly cardiovascular system control and respiratory system control, these are very important features to pay attention to. So a quick review. There's your sympathetic, acetylcholine in that case, norepinephrine in this case. Norepinephrine is actually released by the organ it attaches to. Parasympathetic, this nerve, the preganglionic nerve, travels right to that ganglion, which is almost sitting on the organ itself or the particular muscle itself. And then you get this unmyelinated postganglionic nerve that releases acetylcholine, usually. Again, another review to look at this. Okay, use this chart just to kind of study from. Again, the length of the fibers, the preganglionic, postganglionic. Some people call this presynaptic, postsynaptic at one time, but now they focus on the ganglion itself. That means where that synapse body is. And usually, again, in sympathetic, the ganglia are close to the trunk. You get that sympathetic trunk. And the parasympathetic, the ganglia are spread all over the place, not in a centralized region, but on the effector organ itself. So what is the functions? This is what we're going to finish now. What's the function of the parasympathetic and sympathetic systems? And these are big generalizations. And guys, one is not turned off while the other's turned on. They're both on together, competing with each other. And sometimes the competition gets so intense that really what happens is the system shuts down and seizes. And this can be quite a problem sometimes, but generally what you get is this mild gradual back and forth that produces a homeostasis that is either primarily parasympathetic or sympathetic, or somewhere in between. So sympathetic controls maintenance of conservation of energy. That means the body at rest, but also the body doing things that are associated with resting activities like reading and things like that. So its activity is typified by a person that's relaxing, that's reading, believe it or not, because that reading requires a certain degree of eye adjustment that is typical of the parasympathetic system for close vision, and also trying to catch as much, light as possible to focus on something, okay, at a tight spot, not in a big area. It's focusing in that light for a particular small area. It's also associated with helping the digestion of a meal to make sure that the blood pressure is adequate, blood flow is adequate, and the enzymes are needed to digest that meal. Because mostly it's not blood flow that affects digestion of food, but the enzymes being there at the right time through those parasympathetic secretions. And again, heart rate, respiratory flow, we try to conserve blood flow, blood pressure, and heart rates while we're at rest. And we try to reduce respiratory function at rest because we don't need that much lung activity. Digestive system is activated. Also, what happens is we tend to be in a mode of conserving sugar, turning sugar into fat and storing glycogen and other things in parasympathetic mode. And the pupils are usually very narrow and constricted for collecting and funneling light into a smaller area. It blocks peripheral light, but allows us also to focus and concentrate on one spot, which helps with reading. And this is why sometimes when you stare at a screen a lot and you look away, it's very disoriented because your pupils are so restricted, but they're also kind of a little opening because of the light coming from the screen. So it's a very confusing thing to look at screens and actually is not good for the body. You're better off looking in a book with mild lighting. We tend to keep lighting a little less in a room because it doesn't confuse the eye to being open but constricted at the same time. And also the pupil also constricts to work with the shape of the lens to focus light again on a small area. The role of the sympathetic division is to mobilize fight or flight, we call this. That means stress response. We're funneling energy to skeletal muscle. What we're doing is pumping glucose into the body. Fat cells are releasing fat, which is good. It's not storing fat. It's turning glycogen into glucose, which can deprive muscle of stored sugar reserves. It's opening up those lungs, dilating the bronchioles, increasing blood flow to the lungs, and dilating those vessels to get the best exchange of gases. That means the intake of oxygen, exhaust of CO2, and again, the liver is releasing glucose from stored glycogen. And fat is also releasing fat into the blood. So this is why sometimes if you exercise, your blood fat will go up if you ever go for a physical. And it doesn't mean that's bad. It just means, hey, I'm burning fat. That's my sympathetic system doing its thing. It also adjusts. So guys, pay very special attention to this now when we look at the innervation of the parasympathetic versus the sympathetic. So we're going to start with the parasympathetic and look at where it comes from. It comes from the lower brain and the middle brain, the lower telencephalon, the middle brain, and it comes from that little chordae equi around the sacrum and through the upper part of the sacrum. So look at these pathways. There's none coming off the actual vertebrae themselves. It starts above the cervical vertebrae. So there we go. We see the parasympathetic innervates the eye to make the eye specific for close vision. It kind of dims the amount of light going into the eye, so you don't want to have too much bright light when you're reading, but not too dark because then you can't see the letters. This so allows constriction of the eye. It allows the salivary glands to encourage them to produce saliva. Stress sometimes gives you dry mouth because that inhibits salivary action. It helps to slow down the heart, the strength, and the beating rate. It slows down the lungs, gets the stomach smooth muscle ready to go. It helps to produce digestive enzymes. Same is true for the pancreas, digestive enzymes. It tends to produce digestive enzymes in the liver. It gets the gallbladder activated, being ready to digest fats, but it also causes the taking up of material. So what foods you take in gets stored as glycogen or as fats. And the parasympathetic nervous system tends to also interact with the bladder, okay, to facilitate basically the release of body wastes, because that's a thing you do at rest, and also tends to be involved in one part of the sexual response, particularly the part associated with getting to the excitation stage that leads before an orgasm, because the orgasm itself is sympathetic system. Getting to that point is parasympathetic nervous system. And this is where sex-enhancing drugs like Viagra and testosterone come into effect with the actual parasympathetic response. They also tell you to relax during sex. Don't get too crazy about it, because this helps to lead up to the actual orgasm. Now let's look at the sympathetic system. It dilates, it opens up that pupil, doesn't constrict it. It allows the lens to reshape. It gets an eye ready for collecting a lot of light and a lot of area. It gives good peripheral distance vision. This doesn't work well with the same features of the parasympathetic, so it's hard to read, hard to see close. That usually becomes fuzzy while distant images become clear. The opposite is true for here. The skin, this encourages sweating, gets the skin ready for sweating. Sympathetic reduces saliva production. It can produce dry mouth. Gets the lungs ready for heavy breathing, the heart ready for pumping heavy and pumping frequently. It reduces digestive system enzymes in the stomach, in the pancreas. It tells the liver, hey man, we got to pump out fats and convert glycogen into glucose that's pumped into the blood. Let's get ready some action. And also let's redivert fats to muscle so they can use it when we can't use glucose to run muscle, and if we don't want muscle running anaerobically. It tends to prevent the bladder from releasing waste, because when you're running around, the last thing you want to do is being driven down your leg, and also does the same for pooping. Okay, I should say defecation. And it tends to kind of do funky things to your reproductive tract, particularly encouraging orgasm. Okay, now what we're doing is isolating the parasympathetic nervous system. Notice, guys, from the brain stem and lower brain, from the sacrum. There's all the organs. Please pay attention to this. And notice that the pancreas here is only associated with the parasympathetic system. Let's look at sympathetic system. Notice the sympathetic trunk, preganglionic or presynaptic nerve. That's the short one. Then we have the nerve cell body of the postganglionic nerve, and look at that long pathway for the postganglionic axon that goes to a particular body feature. And these are actually close. These are actually situated here and here. And notice it's mostly the lumbar and thoracic region. It starts about, lower to mid thoracic. And this trunk lies parallel to that. So look, no pancreas. There's really no effect on the pancreas. There is on the liver, but it does affect all the other body structures. This is a nice close-up showing your central nervous system, autonomic, which again is actually kind of peripheral in a way. Okay, so that's the trunk. There's one on the other side. So this means for the sympathetic system, this is where your ganglia for the postsynaptic is, or postganglionic, and there's a nerve trunk that runs to that particular organ. And then your preganglionic comes out of here and into there. Let me do that in another color. And that's very short, or relatively short. So control of the autonomic nervous system, we're reaching the end of this talk, is controlled by the hypothalamus, again, which is in that region of the brain that controls and interprets all these body processes. It's a little mini brain, an integrative center that also communicates with the endocrine system. So the endocrine system knows what's going on with the autonomic nervous system. It's this incredible amount of control that has a lot of breakdown and a lot of specific enzymes and neurotransmitters that can come under the aspects of genetic defects. So we can see here that when we look at control of the autonomic nervous system, the cerebral cortex, that means your actual conscious and sometimes unconscious part of the brain is associated with it, particularly the motor functions. The limbic system, which is involved in emotions, you can actually have emotional association with autonomic control. This is what allows you sometimes to enjoy something, to not enjoy something. It also gives you the ability to develop these reflex routines and associations between different stimuli. Your hypothalamus, again, overall integration. The brainstem carries out certain reflexes, like the pupil reflexes is one that doctors look at a lot, and also the response to pressure, swallowing, sweating, and then the control in the spinal cord, particularly associated with urination, defecation, erection, ejaculation. That means the release of basically the sperm in the male, because females don't release sperm. So again, just look at the control, appreciate it. How the autonomic nervous system is so embedded in the rest of the body. Now, one little side note is that because the autonomic nervous system and the somatic nervous system these nerves travel long distances throughout the body and interact with plexi and trunks and ganglionic, associations. Nerve pathways sometimes start out in a close place, travel to a far place when it comes to the motor, but with sensory, they come from far distant places and funnel into one little location. So that means your whole leg can have all these signals coming in from different parts of the leg, but it funnels into one little region in the spinal cord that then sends one signal to the brain that says this is coming from, L2 or L3. And that produces sometimes a feature called referred pain, where pain could occur. Okay, and that's a human body. The actual pain is being felt here, but it might be sensed in a general area that is associated with the pain, but it's hard to locate. And this is the bane of being a doctor, is finding out where it is. This is true not for somatic pain, that means of the muscles and whatever, but also for visceral pain. That means internal organs. Because sometimes the internal organs, their pathways parallel somatic, and what might feel like muscle pain might actually be an internal organ pain. So this is called referred pain. And these are sections of referred pains. That means the surface of the body, muscles and skin, can actually be thought to be where the pain is coming from based on where visceral signals are being transported into the brain. So the heart usually is felt on the left side of the body, usually the breast. The liver can be felt in the right breast, and it's actually above the liver where most of the pain is felt. Pancreas right around here, etc. You could read this. So this is what's kind of neat about looking at the body, is we can use this general region of pain to say, is it muscle pain or is it referred pain from the heart? And that tells you, basically, what do I look for? But it's not going to necessarily be your first guess. You have to do further investigation. So on that note, that's the autonomic nervous system.